What if the woman they called a parasite was the hidden heiress to a billion-dollar empire? They laughed at her simple dress. They mocked her for daring to breathe their rarefied air. They thought she was weak. They thought she was disposable. But in their arrogance, they forgot one brutal truth. Sometimes the quietest one in the room owns everything. And when she decides to reveal herself, no empire built on cruelty can survive. The Aldridge estate rose out of the mist like a kingdom carved from stone, its sharp towers and endless marble steps, designed to impress and intimidate. And as Sophia stepped out of the black town car, clutching the simple bouquet she had brought as a gesture of goodwill, she could already feel the weight of their eyes pressing down on her, like a judgment passed before she even crossed the threshold. Her modest navy dress fluttered slightly in the cold spring wind, a stark contrast to the sleek designer gowns and sharp suits that filled the sprawling courtyard beyond. And as she approached the grand doors, her husband, Mark murmured a weak reassurance she knew he didn't believe. Inside the house was colder than the evening air, polished surfaces gleaming under chandeliers, so massive they seemed almost obscene, and the family gathered in curated clusters around gold-rimmed glasses of champagne barely disguised their disdain as she entered. Whispers floated just out of earshot. Comments about the girl from nowhere, the charity case he married, and Sophia Hart hammering against her ribs, smiled with the quiet dignity she had learned long ago, offering polite greetings that were returned with brittle smiles and averted gazes. Mark's mother, Eleanor Aldridge, approached last, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, her perfume thick and cloying, her eyes raking over Sophia's outfit with the precision of a scalpel. "Well," she said, voice syrupy with condescension, "I suppose every dynasty has its charity projects." A titter of laughter rippled through the nearby guests, and Sophia, her cheeks burning, simply inclined her head, refusing to let the venom see her bleed. Dinner was worse. Seated at the long cavernous table under the watchful gaze of oil-painted ancestors, Sophia endured veiled barbs, disguised as jokes, subtle slights buried under the clink of silverware, each one driving deeper into the hollow ache growing inside her chest. Every time she tried to speak to, offer a kindness, a memory, a dream, she was drowned out by louder voices, sharper laughs, the conversation sweeping past her like a current she was never meant to swim. And when dessert was served delicate and glittering, like everything else in the Aldridge world, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, lifted her glass, and with a smile that could have cut glass, said loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "Here's to Sophia proof that even the smallest parasite can find a very comfortable host." The room erupted in laughter, some genuine, some nervous, but none brave enough to break the tide, and Sophia, feeling the room tilt and blur around her, lowered her eyes to her plate, willing herself not to shatter Balhor, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her crack. Across the table, Mark stared down at his drink, silent, complicit, small, and something inside Sophia, small trembling thing she had kept hidden for so long, began to stir, to harden, to breathe. They thought she had nothing. They thought they could erase her with a few cruel words, but they had no idea who they had just dared to wake. The laughter still echoed in her ears long after the clinking of glasses faded, and the servants began clearing the plates, each soft scrape of silver against porcelain, slicing deeper into the hollow space inside Sophia's chest, where trust and hope once lived. And as the guests migrated toward the drawing room, with their wine and whispered gossip, she followed silently her steps, light her head, bowed, trying to fold herself smaller, so that maybe she could escape further notice. But cruelty once unleashed is never content with a single blow. It circles it, lingers. It waits for the perfect moment to strike again. And as Sophia entered the room, lined with priceless paintings and roaring fires, she heard it, the low snicker, the casual cruelty thrown like a spear across the room. Honestly, Mark could have married anyone. And he chose her. What did she bring to the table besides empty hands and a pretty enough face? Another voice sharper chimed in without hesitation. Maybe she thought she could climb out of poverty by clinging to our name. Maybe she thought pity was enough. The words sliced into Sophia's skin, invisible but deep, and she felt her fingers tighten around the delicate clutch she carried, her knuckles whitening as she forced herself to stay still, to stay silent, to survive. She searched for Mark's face in the crowd, for the man who had once promised to shield her from this world of wolves, but found only his back turned toward her, his laughter soft, complicit. A blade she had not expected, but somehow always known was waiting. Eleanor approached then, a glass of red wine in hand, her smile, all teeth and malice, and without lowering her voice she said, "We thought she was a Phase A rebellion. But now she's just an embarrassment. We have to dress up and parade around like some charity project. What a shame." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, the room tilting slightly as the blood drained from her face, and for a moment she stood suspended in time, trapped between the life she had built and the life they would never let her have. And then with every eye, either gleaming with amusement or carefully looking away, Eleanor leaned in closer, her voice a silk-wrapped dagger. "Parasites," she whispered, "have a way of killing their hosts if you let them linger too long." The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the final seal, the public branding the moment they wanted her to break. But Sophia didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply smiled. Slow, quiet, terrifying smile that no one noticed, because they had already turned away, satisfied with the spectacle they had created. She smiled because they had just made the gravest mistake of their privileged lives. They had underestimated her. They had forgotten that some bloodlines are not worn like jewelry. Some are forged in silence, hidden, waiting for the right moment to remind the world exactly who they are. And Sophia Lancaster, daughter of an empire they dared mock, was done being silent. Sophia stood alone at the edge of the room, the voices blurring into a sickening hum, the clink of crystal and the rustle of silk like knives brushing against her skin. And though she smiled, though she sipped her untouched champagne and nodded politely at passing glances, something inside her was breaking in a way that felt different from hurt. Something quieter, colder, cleaner. The kind of breaking that doesn't end in tears, but in transformation. She excused herself with a murmur no one heard, and climbed the grand staircase, each step heavier than the last, her hands trailing over the carved banister, polished by generations of Aldridge pride. And when she reached the guest room, they had shoved her into far from the family suites tucked into a dim corner of the east wings. She closed the door softly behind her, locking it with a click that sounded like the snapping of a chain deep inside her chest. She stood there in the silence for a long moment, letting the night settle around her like a shroud, before crossing the room to the small writing desk tucked beneath the window. From the depths of her bag, she pulled out a battered phone, its screen cracked at the corner, its contacts almost empty except for one name. She had never deleted one connection she had buried deep to protect herself from a life she had once run from. Her fingers hovered over the name for only a second before she pressed call, the line ringing once, twice, and then answered with a sharp intake of breath on the other end, as if the person had been waiting for this call for years. Sophia didn't say hello. She didn't explain. She didn't cry. She spoke 5 words, her voice steady as steel. "It's time, I'm coming home." A pause followed, heavy with meaning, and then the voice, rich and unmistakable, replied simply, "We've been waiting." Sophia ended the call, exhaling slowly, her shoulders straightening the weight she had carried alone for so long, finally beginning to shift, not lighter, but different. No longer a burden she had to hide, but a weapon she would soon wield. Downstairs, the Aldridge family laughed and toasted their own cleverness, unaware that the woman they thought they had broken had just called down a force they couldn't begin to comprehend. Sophia placed the phone carefully on the desk, smoothing her hands over the simple fabric of her dress, as if shedding the last remnants of the disguise they had forced her to wear. They had called her a parasite. They had called her nothing. They had called her a mistake. Tomorrow they would call her something else entirely. Tomorrow they would remember her name. Morning broke with a chill mist hanging low over the estate grounds, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sophia rose before the sun, her movements quiet and deliberate, as she packed her few belongings into a small leather bag. She left behind the carefully curated trappings of the Aldridge family with the same indifference they had shown her. She didn't glance at the expensive dresses hanging in the guest closet or the polished jewelry boxes resting atop the dresser. None of it had ever been meant for her. None of it had ever mattered in the world she was about to re-enter. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale light over the manicured lawns. When she descended the stairs, her footsteps silent against the marble, her simple shoes, whispering defiance against the floors that had once seemed too grand to touch. She paused briefly at the threshold of the drawing room, where remnants of the previous night's festivities lingered. Half-empty glasses carelessly abandoned the faint sourness of stale perfume and pride. For a moment, she simply watched the sleeping empire her husband's family had built, on vanity and cruelty, unaware that it was about to crumble in their hands. Outside in the circular driveway, black cars gleamed like polished obsidian, the kind of vehicles that move without sound, the kind that carried not celebrities, but sovereigns. At their center, waiting with the stillness of a coiled storm, stood Victoria Lancaster. Her presence sliced through the fog like a blade. In her tailored black coat and severe chignon, she looked every inch the empire Sophia had fled from. But now, as Sophia stepped forward, the old fear did not rise. Only something steadier, something inevitable. Victoria's sharp eyes softened almost imperceptibly when they met Sophia's. Without a word, she extended a hand, an invitation, a summons, a command. Sophia hesitated only a second, then placed her hand into her mother's. Feeling the latent power there, the strength that had never been cruel, only waiting, only patient for her to return. As the doors to the lead car opened, revealing the gleaming interior, Victoria turned briefly to the assembled Aldridge family, now gathering on the front steps, confused and annoyed by the commotion. In a voice low enough to be terrifying, she said, "My daughter will no longer be insulted by parasites who mistake inheritance for merit." Sophia climbed into the car without looking back. As the convoy pulled away from the estate, leaving the stunned Aldridges shrinking in the rearview mirror, she felt it, the first true breath of freedom she had taken in years. Not because she was returning to wealth, not because she was reclaiming her name, but because for the first time, she would choose her future on her own terms, and the world that thought it knew her story had no idea what was coming next. The convoy wove through the city like a black river, cutting through glass and concrete, drawing glances of fear and awe from everyone it passed, and inside the lead car, Sophia sat in silence, watching the skyline sharpen into focus, as if the entire world had been holding itself blurry, until now her reflection in the tinted glass no longer the ghost of a girl who begged for scraps of kindness, but the steel silhouette of a woman who would no longer be overlooked. Victoria sat beside her, saying nothing, needing nothing, her presence alone, a fortress Sophia could lean against without shame, and when the convoy pulled up to the Lancaster building, a tower of steel and black glass that seemed to pierce the clouds, Sophia felt the shift beneath her feet, the slow tectonic movement of destiny realigning itself around her. They ascended in a private elevator, the doors opening directly into a boardroom so vast it felt like another world. And there the Lancaster executives waited, standing in silent deference, men and women who controlled fortunes, with a signature people who knew power, not by rumor, but by living in its gravity, and every single one of them bowed their heads slightly when Sophia entered, because they knew, even if the Aldridges hadn't, who she was. Victoria placed a hand lightly on Sophia's back, a subtle nudge forward, and Sophia took her place at the head of the gleaming black table without hesitation. Folding her hands neatly in front of her as the room settled, as if the building itself exhaled in relief that she had finally come home. Victoria's voice, when it broke, the silence was low and absolute. It's time they understand who they insulted. Files were placed before Sophia, contracts, ownership shares, quiet investments that the Lancaster family had over generations sunk into businesses like the Aldridges' empire, invisible strings that, when pulled, could unravel everything they thought they owned. Sophia read the documents with steady eyes, no tremor in her hands, no flicker of doubt. And when she reached the final page, she looked up, meeting her mother's gaze, and then the eyes of every executive in the room. "Pull everything," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the force of a declaration that no one dared question. Every penny, every ounce of protection, every silent favor. The executives moved without a word, the machinery of consequences already grinding into motion. And in that moment, Sophia realized she didn't feel satisfaction or vengeance. She felt something deeper, something colder and purer. The restoration of balance, the righting of a scale that had been tipped for too long by arrogance and cruelty. As signatures were made, calls dispatched, accounts frozen, and contracts dissolved, the Aldridge family's world began to collapse. Not with a roar, but with a silent, inexorable unraveling that left no room for mercy. They had called her a parasite, a burden, a mistake. Now they would learn what it felt like to be made invisible, to be stripped of the illusion of invincibility they had clung to so tightly. And as the first calls of panic began to ring in the Aldridge estate, unanswered and desperate, Sophia Lancaster sat in the heart of her true inheritance, calm, unshaken, the quiet architect of a reckoning long overdue. While the Aldridges scrambled to understand why their accounts were frozen and their investors pulled out without warning, Sophia sat at the Lancaster estate overlooking the city, from a terrace lined with black marble statues, each one a silent sentinel to the power her bloodline had always commanded. She sipped her coffee, slowly savoring not the destruction, but the peace that came from finally stepping into the light she had spent years hiding from. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling gold, across the skyline, news alerts began lighting up every screen in the country. Headlines blaring the downfall of the once mighty Aldridge empire, speculating on secret power plays and sudden financial disasters. But nowhere yet did they realize the quiet woman they had humiliated was the very hand closing the trap. Back at the estate, Mark arrived unannounced, his face pale, his suit, rumpled-d desperation pouring off him in waves as he demanded to see Sophia, barging past the stunned servants and storming into the great hall where she stood by a grand piano, sunlight pouring through the stained glass behind her like a coronation. For a moment, neither of them spoke the space between them, heavy with everything that could never be unsaid. Then he rushed forward, hands outstretched, pleading, "Sophia, I didn't know. I swear I never wanted them to treat you like that. I loved you. I still love you. Please, we can fix this together." Sophia regarded him with a silence so absolute it made the cavernous hall seem small. A silence not of anger, but of complete and final understanding. And when she spoke, her voice was soft enough to bruise. "You didn't love me, Mark. You loved what marrying me could give you, when you thought I was nothing. You laughed with them. You let them crush me. And now you see who I am. You want to crawl back." Her words didn't rise or tremble. They were steady, relentless, each one landing with the precision of a blade, and Mark crumpled before her, not from violence, but from the unbearable weight of realizing he had destroyed the one thing he could never replace. As he stammered his apologies, Victoria entered the hall, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, and without even sparing him a glance, she said coldly, "Escort this man out. He no longer has a place here." Two security guards materialized from the shadows, moving forward with professional detachment, and Mark's protests echoed down the halls, growing fainter, until the great doors slammed shut behind High M, leaving only silence and the faint trembling of the air where he had stood. Sophia turned away from the door, not because she was cruel, but because she was done bleeding for people who never deserved her. And as she looked out across the vast gardens, blooming with the fierce, stubborn life her family had cultivated for generations, she realized that true power wasn't just inherited, it was chosen, it was claimed, it was lived every day and every moment. You refused to let the world define you by anything other than the fire you carried inside. And Sophia Lancaster carried an inferno. The world expected Sophia to return to the Lancaster dynasty in full force, to wear the crown that was rightfully hers, to walk into every room dripping with inherited power, and watch as the same people who once sneered at her now scrambled to kneel. But Sophia had learned something deeper, something sharper during her years. Among those who measured worth by appearances, she realized that real strength was not in reclaiming old thrones, but in building new worlds where no one else would be forced to endure what she had endured. And so, when Victoria gathered the Lancaster board members in the grand meeting hall, when she announced with fierce maternal pride that Sophia would assume her seat at the head of the empire, Sophia stood slowly, let the applause fall into expectant silence, and shook her head. Once a small, quiet movement that felt like a thunderclap through the room. "I am grateful," she said, her voice carrying with a weight beyond volume, "but I am not here to inherit, I am here to create something new." And the murmurs of confusion rose like static, as Sophia stepped forward, outlined her plan, not to simply expand the Lancaster fortune, but to split off her own independent venture, a foundation built to invest in women who had been discarded, overlooked, humiliated the way she had been. a living, breathing rejection of the world that only valued polished exteriors. Victoria's face, unreadable, broke into the smallest, rarest smile, a flash of respect, so raw it left the room stunned, and without hesitation, she nodded, signaling her blessing and her support, because Victoria Lancaster had not raised her daughter to be a shadow of the family legacy. She had raised her to be the architect of her own. Sophia spent the next weeks quietly building her team, handpicking women and men who understood what it meant to fight for dignity. Not because of a name, but because of a calling. Her headquarters were not built in gleaming skyscrapers, but in renovated community centers. Her outreach was not measured in headlines, but in lives changed quietly, powerfully, enduringly. She rejected interviews, refused photo ops, declined magazine covers, despite the relentless media hunger to brand her as the new heiress queen. Because Sophia knew that real revolutions do not begin with noise. They begin with silence, with work, with relentless unseen tides that reshape the shorelines of the world without asking permission. Back at the Aldridge estate, the decay spread rapidly. Investors vanished, clients fled, reputations shattered, and the family that once ruled by cruelty found themselves adrift, abandoned, irrelevant, and, in every whisper of their downfall, there was Sophia's name, not shouted, not gloated, but carried like a quiet, inevitable truth. A reminder that the greatest victories are not the ones where you destroy your enemies, but the ones where you leave them to destroy themselves, while you rise beyond there. Reach Sophia's foundation grew faster than anyone predicted, not because of flashy marketing or viral moments, but because it tapped into something raw and universal, a hunger for dignity, a thirst for spaces where worth was measured not by family names or bank accounts, but by courage and kindness and resilience. Within months, the Sophia Lancaster Initiative had funded hundreds of scholarships, launched dozens of mentorship programs, rebuilt shelters, and transformed abandoned libraries into thriving community hubs. Everywhere it touched, lives, a new kind of power, began to bloom. Silent, steady. Undeniable. Sophia traveled constantly not by private jets or armored convoys, but by simple means, walking into classrooms, hospitals, and shelters with the same humility she had once been mocked for. She listened more than she spoke, seeing people who had been invisible for too long. At every stop, people cried, not because she had saved them, but because she had reminded them they never needed saving, only seeing, only believing, only someone to open the door they had been pounding on in silence for years. In the polished halls of the elite, murmurs turned to grudging respect, then to awe. Sophia Lancaster, who could have ruled with an iron fist, chose instead to lift quietly. And because of that, her influence became something even Victoria had never achieved. Not fear, not envy, but reverence. She had reshaped the battlefield entirely, turning cruelty into a relic of the past. In spaces where power once protected only the powerful, now it protects the overlooked, the dismissed, the so-called parasites who had always been more than enough. Meanwhile, Victoria watched her daughter's ascent with the sharp pride of a general witnessing a new queen. Not one bred for war, but for rebirth. Though she continued to manage the Lancaster Empire, she slowly began shifting more resources behind Sophia's vision. Recognizing with an acuity only the truly powerful possess that the future belonged to those who could inspire, not intimidate. One evening under the soft glow of the Lancaster terrace as the city lights flickered below, Victoria placed a hand lightly on Sophia's shoulder and said quietly, "You have done what I never could. You have made them love you, not because they fear you, but because they believe in you." Sophia, with a quiet smile, answered simply, "I didn't make them love me. I reminded them they were already worthy of love." Across the world, in places Sophia would never walk, her name became synonymous with transformation. Not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that rewrites the human spirit, one life at a time. For the first time in generations, the Lancaster name did not just mean power. It meant hope, it meant healing. It meant that sometimes the ones you cast aside build the worlds you end up begging to enter. And Sophia Lancaster, the girl they had called a parasite now, stood taller than any empire they had ever dreamed of. The world moved forward, but Sophia's mark remained etched into its fabric, like veins of gold hidden beneath stone. Not loud, not ostentatious, but enduring, undeniable. A quiet revolution that had started the night she chose not to shatter in the face of cruelty, but to rise from it, stronger than any dynasty built on arrogance and appearance. Across boardrooms and backstreets, her influence whispered through new laws, new scholarships, new companies restructured, not for profit alone, but for dignity. Everywhere her standard spread, the same story echoed. The story of the girl they called a parasite, who became the architect of a future even her enemies were forced to admire. In a rare televised interview, a renowned historian summed it up best. Sophia Lancaster taught the world that true power is not inherited, it is revealed, and only those who survive their own erasure can truly rebuild what was broken. In the quiet hours before dawn, Sophia often stood on the balcony of her modest new home, overlooking gardens she had planted herself, not cared for by legions of staff, but tended with her own hands. A reminder that growth takes time. Care resilience. As the wind brushed through the budding roses, she smiled, not at the victories won, not at enemies humbled, but at the countless lives now blooming, because she refused to be buried under their contempt. In distant places she would never visit young women, spoke her name when they walked into interviews, when they demanded respect, when they chose not to shrink. Because they remembered her story, not as a fairy tale, but as a blueprint of what was possible. In the crumbling ruins of the Aldridge estate, where echoes of laughter once mocked a girl in a simple dress, silence reigned. The surviving members of the family learned the harshest lesson of all. Wealth without honor is just rot wrapped in gold. Sophia never returned there, not because she was afraid or bitter, but because she had built something so much greater that looking back simply didn't matter anymore. Her life had become a testament that legacy is not what you leave behind for others to remember you by, but what you build inside others that they carry forward without even realizing it. Sophia Lancaster once walked into a house that tried to crush her, and now she walked across a world she had helped to heal. The world bowed not because she demanded it, but because it understood, finally, truly and forever, who she had always been. They tried to bury her in shame. They thought they stripped her of worth, but they only revealed their own emptiness. Sophia Lancaster didn't destroy them out of vengeance. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't return their cruelty. She simply rose, higher, stronger, untouchable. And in doing so, she gave voice to millions who had been silenced. Because real power isn't loud, it is silent, steady, and unstoppable.